Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. My name is Bob Berry. I'll be your moderator today. And today we're going to explore a series of upcoming seminars on trauma-informed care trainings from Barry and Janae Weinhold and the Colorado Professional Development Center. Before I turn it over to Barry and Janae to talk about those seminars, I want to let you know that in the upper right of your Adobe Connect screen are a few links to let you sign up for the upcoming seminars and the contact phone number, which you may want to take note of. Now I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Barry Weinhold and Dr. Janae Weinhold of the Colorado Professional Development Center. A little bit about them before we get started. Dr. Barry Weinhold is a licensed psychologist in private practice and professor emeritus from the University of Colorado at Colorado Springs, where he taught for 30 years. Barry also founded the Counseling and Human Services MA program at UCCS in 1974. And Barry is a clinical specialist in attachment and developmental trauma, and the author or co-author of no less than 55 books on developmental psychology, conflict resolution, and trauma. And currently, he co-directs the Colorado Professional Development Center and the Colorado Institute for Conflict Resolution and Creative Leadership with Janae. And about Janae, Dr. Janae Weinhold is a licensed professional counselor in private practice, a clinical specialist in attachment and developmental trauma, a former adjunct professor at UCCS, and is the author or co-author of 10 books on developmental psychology, conflict resolution, and trauma. Since 1994, Janae has been providing clinical training and consultation services in practical psychology for mental health practitioners in Kiev, Ukraine. And during their over 30 years of collaboration, the Weinholds have created a clinical and theoretical model that identifies developmental trauma as the major cause of mental and physical illness, relationship conflicts, and human suffering. In today's webinar, they are going to share with you how and why they developed this approach. They'll talk about why trauma-informed care is an important credential for mental health professionals and describe for you their trauma-informed care training programs coming up in the early part of 2016. Looking forward to hearing about this. I'll turn it over to Barry and Janae to find out more of what's going on.
Thanks a lot, Bob.
Thanks, Bob, and welcome, everybody.
We're really glad to be here, and we're looking forward to sharing more about how we developed our approach. We've been at it for a while, over 30 years now, but it was about 3 years into our marriage that we began to encounter conflict. And so we started to look at where was it coming from. We were able to identify that neglect played a big part in the conflicts that we were experiencing in our relationship. We discovered a lot of family patterns containing early trauma, and that the closer we got, the more intimate we became, the more conflict that we had.
About the same time in our private practice as mental health professionals, we began to recognize the symptoms of early trauma and the symptoms of PTSD in our clients. However, they didn't seem to have any significant traumatic events in their background that they could remember that would account for these symptoms. So the couples that we saw, like us, were having serious conflicts and didn't know why.
Then we began to look deeper into their childhood histories and into our own. And what we discovered was pretty interesting. Most of these traumas were caused by neglect rather than abuse. We didn't realize, and neither did our clients, that we were being neglected as children because, of course, with neglect, nothing happens. We all just didn't connect the dots in our relationship problems with the long-term impact of childhood neglect.
Once we began to recognize the role of early trauma in our relational conflicts and intimacy issues, we decided to use our relationship as a sort of laboratory. We wanted to resolve our own conflicts and intimacy issues for sure, but also we wanted to do this and learn how to do this before we could offer anything to help our clients resolve their issues.
Over time, we created tools to help ourselves get through these conflicts. Then we tested them with our clients, and if they worked with clients, then we taught them to our graduate students. And eventually, we shared them with others in the articles and the books that we wrote.
To try to make sense out of all these issues, we created a theory called developmental systems theory. It's a meta-theory based on all our research that we've done, and it contains 2 tracks of human development. One is the ideal track of development and how that should happen. And then the second track shows how development gets stuck or delayed because of early trauma.
We also created developmental process work, a clinical model to help our clients heal this early developmental trauma. Our approach has been tested cross-culturally, particularly in Europe and mostly in Eastern Europe, where I've been working with young mental health professionals in Ukraine.
In about 2009, we read a statement by Harvard psychologist Bessel van der Kolk, and he said that there's a need for a college textbook that would give mental health counselors a foundation in trauma. So we wrote one. It's titled Healing Developmental Trauma, a Systems Approach to Counseling Individuals, Couples, and Families.
We also found, as we were writing our textbook, a lot of research that validated our work on human development. Bruce Perry and others found that early childhood trauma adversely affects brain development. Because the brain is use-dependent, trauma can cause parts of the brain to shut down.
We also looked at Ed Tronick's interesting research on the cold mother, and he showed the impact of early relational trauma on infants.
Alan Shore's research showed how the right brain to right brain synchrony produces therapeutic changes when clients and therapists can get in sync.
Bessel van der Kolk found that trauma causes a disconnect between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex of the brain. This causes a lack of empathy in people, and also it makes it hard for them to be very intimate with other people.
Stephen Porges discovered the social engagement system, which is actually a third part to the nervous system that regulates social behaviors and social interactions.
We also went back and looked at the research of Mary Ainsworth, who showed that mother-infant relationships create certain attachment styles in infants, and she had a strange situation protocol that she used, and she identified secure and insecure attachment styles.
Mary Main, who is actually a student of Mary Ainsworth, and Eric Hesse then went on to continue this line of research, and they discovered attachment styles develop in the first year of life and that they persist throughout adulthood. And they created this adult attachment interview that helped to validate all of that.
Dan Siegel cites a lot of research indicating that the brain and the nervous system have neuroplasticity. That means that they can repair themselves. And what he found is that effective interpersonal interventions is one of the best ways to help change the wiring in our brains.
The adverse childhood experiences, also known as ACE research, which was conducted by the Center for Disease Control, showed that the long-term effects of adverse childhood experiences on the mental and the physical health of adults. And this research has been validated by an additional 60 studies. We didn't realize that something that was so near and dear to our hearts would become controversial, but it did. It has. Bessel van der Kolk and other clinicians who had discovered developmental trauma, they decided that there needed to be a whole new diagnostic category added to the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual, and they called this developmental trauma disorder. So they and their team submitted the most research and documentation that's ever been presented in a request to add a new diagnostic category. In 2011, the DSM Trauma Committee rejected their request.
And then after the trauma didn't get added to the DSM, we heard Bessel van der Kolk speak in 2014 in Denver, and we were shocked to hear him say, quote, "Counselor training programs don't give students a foundation in trauma and are licensing them to do malpractice." We agreed with this, and we also believe that people who are trained to be mental health professionals need trauma-informed care and attachment-informed care information in order to practice effectively and ethically.
So we now like to look at the national push. There really is a big campaign to get the whole mental health profession trauma informed. And SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, is leading the way. SAMHSA says that 90% of all clients suffer from symptoms of childhood trauma. They and the National Council on Behavioral Health are really collaborating to get people trauma informed. Both of them offer a wealth of free materials that you can find if you go to their websites.
Actually, 12 states now have launched statewide initiatives on trauma-informed care to get every person in the whole mental health system trauma-informed. Colorado is not one of those, but the Colorado Division of Behavioral Health is planning its own initiative, and we'll look forward to that happening in the near future, hopefully. The governor's task force on mental health also has recommended that everybody get trauma informed in the state of Colorado. And so there's a big push in the state to move forward on this initiative. We think that being certified in trauma informed care is now recognized as an important professional credential for all mental health workers.
So let's take an overview of trauma informed care. What is it? Let's begin first with the definition of trauma. SAMHSA defines trauma as the result of an event, series of events, or set of circumstances that are experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has long-lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or, and I would say, and spiritual well-being.
Although many individuals report a single specific traumatic event, about 90% of those seeking services for mental or substance abuse disorders report having been exposed to multiple or chronic traumatic events.
Here are some facts about trauma. Most people experience trauma during their lifetime. Yep, that's pretty taken for granted. Some people who have repeated chronic or multiple traumas have long-term health consequences. People with substance abuse and mental disorders have experienced trauma as children or adults. Trauma can significantly affect how people function in major life areas and also how they respond to treatment. People with substance abuse problems who have experienced trauma are typically more difficult to treat. Childhood trauma also increases one's risk for the onset of chronic and degenerative diseases. Individuals diagnosed with serious mental illness often have a history of early childhood trauma. Substance abuse and mental disorders can increase the risk of repeated exposure to trauma. Unhealed trauma increases the risk of developing substance abuse and mental health disorders. So SAMHSA has a very specific model of trauma-informed care. We'd like to talk about that.
Let me talk a little bit about that. One of the first things that they talk about is the trauma-informed approach to the delivery of behavioral health services has to include an understanding of the effects of trauma and an awareness of the impact it can have on people's lives. It also involves vigilance in anticipating and avoiding any institutional processes or individual practices that could re-traumatize individuals who already have histories of trauma. It also upholds the importance of consumer participation in the development, delivery, and evaluation of any behavioral health care services. And finally, it views trauma through an ecological and cultural lens, recognizing that the context in which the trauma happens plays a significant role in how individuals perceive it and how they process traumatic events, whether they're acute or chronic.
SAMHSA has put together what they call the 4 R's of a trauma-informed care approach. And so here are some of their guidelines, all beginning with the letter R.
Yeah, they first realized that the widespread impact of trauma and understand that there are potential paths for recovery from trauma. And they recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma in their clients, in families, in the staff, and in others involved in the system. And they respond by fully integrating the knowledge about trauma into their policies, procedures, and practices. And finally, they resist any practices that might re-traumatize the clients.
here are some other principles of trauma-informed care, because trauma-informed care is based on kindness and compassion, and it's also client-centered.
The principles promote trauma awareness and understanding of its long-term effects. This is really important to understand the long-term effects of trauma. And they also view trauma in the context of the client's environment. What has caused the possible trauma? Was it financial? Was it an event? Or was it a series of events in their childhood? It creates a safe environment where clients can explore their trauma and heal. Healing can then occur. It supports that the clients be in control and have choice and have autonomy in this process. And it recognizes that presenting symptoms and behaviors can be adaptations of unhealed traumatic experiences. So it needs to look a little deeper into what symptoms your clients are showing. And it minimizes the risk of re-traumatization or replaying prior traumas in your clients. Identifies recovery from the long-term effects of trauma as a primary goal, and creates collaborative relationships and opportunities for clients to heal their trauma. And finally, it familiarizes clients with trauma-informed care resources and services available in the community.
Trauma-informed care professionals shift the focus away from what's wrong with you to what happened or didn't happen to you. It incorporates universal routine screenings to identify trauma symptoms and long-term effects. It uses a strength-based perspective to promote resilience. It shows both organizational and administrative commitment to trauma-informed care principles and practices. It views trauma through a socio-cultural lens. It fosters the development of trauma-resistant skills and develops strategies to address secondary trauma, vicarious trauma, and it promotes self-care of the therapist. Ultimately, though, it provides hope that recovery is possible, and maybe this is even the most important principle of all.
There are actually two kinds of traumas that we need to look at, and you need to understand the differences between the two. The first one is called event trauma, and this is trauma caused by a single event that leaves an imprint on the central nervous system of the individual. This could be a car accident or even a natural disaster that could cause this imprint. People do remember these traumatic events because they're very present in their lives, and lots of things happen. This causes people to re-experience the effects of an event when they encounter any similar conditions to that trauma, like if they were in a war situation, and if they hear a loud noise, they might react as if they were still in combat. The person recalls the experience that was dysregulating to them and its causes, and this causes flashbacks and re-experiencing associated with what we call PTSD. It can be the cause of self-medicating addictions that people have that seem to help clients cope with the symptoms they have of PTSD.
The other kind of trauma is developmental trauma. And it's the result of multiple experiences of relational trauma that involve child abuse or neglect and adult caregivers. And this leaves an imprint on the central nervous system. Now, people typically, unlike event trauma, they don't remember these early relational experiences. They only know about them when they show up later in their close adult relationships. It's often an encounter with too much intimacy that makes these things return. So what do people do? Well, they learn to avoid this re-experiencing of relational traumas by avoiding situations or people that might trigger any memories of these early relational traumas. And they also can develop self-medicating addictions to help them cope with the symptoms of not PTSD, but developmental trauma disorder, or DTD.
So there are, in our seminars, we talk about trauma-informed and trauma-specific care. So let's talk about the difference between the two. Trauma-informed care, there's a focus on understanding and addressing the long-term effects of trauma. understanding what causes it, what you're looking at when you see trauma, so you understand what it is that your clients are bringing to you. It follows trauma-informed care practices, principles, and protocols that are needed in any practice, any agency. It also focuses on the way that behavioral health care services are delivered to clients. So extreme importance in having the clients be in charge of the process, and also how the clients understand what they need to understand to get better.
Trauma-specific care is a little different. People who do trauma-specific care aren't always trauma-informed, which is interesting, but the trauma-specific care is often more focused on treating symptoms. An example of a trauma-specific care would be EMDR. A lot of people are familiar with that. But with trauma-specific care, there is the use of some evidence-based practice or best practice treatment models that are known to be effective in addressing the impact and the symptoms of trauma. And the protocols and techniques that are used facilitate recovering from the trauma by treating the symptoms of it. Let's look now at some of the unique features of our trauma-informed care training model. We have some unique components that we'd like to talk about that are part of our certificate program. The first component is that participants learn to identify their own hidden childhood traumas caused by neglect and abandonment, as well as by abuse.
In our comprehensive approach, we also identify 7 different components of developmental trauma. And then we also include interventions that have been shown to be effective in healing each of these 7 different components.
We also provide trauma-specific skills for healing trauma, and the one that we use most often is the trauma elimination technique. Also, we call it the TET. And this is a picture of me showing how you do the TET pose when you're working with children.
It also describes the elements of a clinical model that we found works for achieving significant results in clients in about 3 to 6 sessions.
We also include an understanding of developmental psychology and attachment-informed care.
And these are live and very interactive trainings that include a lot of demonstrations and time for skill building and skill training.
We also have an integrative approach where we correlate physical and mental health issues and help trainees see that you can't really separate the mind from the body.
And finally, we emphasize both personal development and professional development of the participants.
Our trauma-informed care programs are also attachment-informed. Attachment and trauma, particularly developmental trauma, are interminably intertwined.
Mary Main's research in the mid-90s showed that about 80 to 90% of those who seek counseling have a disorganized attachment style.
Attachment-informed care means understanding that those with this disorganized attachment style typically have a history of relational or developmental trauma during the first year of life. And then, unless it's healed, this attachment style persists throughout a person's lifetime.
So we also have an emphasis on developmental trauma-informed care. So our training is grounded in developmental psychology, and we bring in, where we can, the whole idea of the study of human growth and development, including the physical, mental, emotional, intellectual, and social changes and milestones that happen in people's lives. And then developmental psychology also provides an understanding of the importance of the pregnancy, the birth, and the first 3 years of life.
Developmental trauma-informed care recognizes that children experience shock, trauma, and stress in their caregiving relationships during the first 3 years of life that are caused mostly by parents' undiscovered, unrecognized, unhealed, disorganized attachment style. Unless it's changed, this attachment style really can have long-lasting effects on a person's life.
We also place an emphasis on healing rather than treating trauma.
So we want to look at what's the difference between healing and treating. And healing is much more client-centered. It can be short-term or long-term. The emphasis, again, is on what happened or didn't happen to the client. There's a focus on the importance of the therapist-client relationship and changing clients' neurobiological wiring and behavior patterns. A goal is to address the problems at their source, to focus on identifying trauma and making meaning of it. This part is really important because we know that when we're able to make meaning out of something, that the trauma itself is transformed. So we also use an integrative mind, body, spirit approach in healing, and the outcome is transformation. So people leave feeling stronger and more capable of coping with life's challenges.
On the other side, treating trauma is often, instead of client-directed, is therapist-directed. And it's typically short-term counseling, and the emphasis is on diagnosis of the problem, and a focus then on using techniques that might reduce the symptoms that are being displayed by the client. It's a cognitive behavioral treatment model, basically. And the outcome is reduction of symptoms and helping clients cope better with their stress and their trauma. Now, this can leave people feeling flawed, broken, helpless, hopeless, and powerless, instead of feeling empowered and stronger.
Now I'd like to talk about our integrative training model. We've mentioned some elements, but we want to kind of pull this together here in this next segment. So an integrative healthcare model promotes an understanding of how physical and mental health are related to each other and how, when we provide services, that needs to be a holistic healthcare model.
The ACE research studies particularly showed clearly that early childhood abuse and neglect have long-term effects on the mental and physical health of adults. It was really surprising to many people to understand this, that if you had 4 or more of these adverse childhood experiences, you had a 50%, greater than 50% risk of having heart disease. If you had 5 or more of these events in your childhood, you actually had, what they found in their follow-up is that people had a shortened lifespan of 20 years. So the risk of any degenerative diseases was then tied to the number of adverse childhood experiences people had in their first 3 years of life.
So our integrative model of trauma-informed care, as I said, uses a holistic mind, body, spirit approach that addresses the issue of how to restore physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual well-being. We also use a multimedia approach in our training groups. We use PowerPoint modules. We help people personalize the material. We have 2 training books that are included in the program. We invite guest speakers. We use musical metaphors. Barry loves that part. He always has some kind of musical piece that we bring to look at. Our courses are also experiential, so people have time for skill training, and we do a lot of demonstrations. Our trainings include an online learning module, and we also feature video segments from some of the experts who have been doing research in this field.
This sometimes is known as a constructivistic training model, and we incorporate that into our training. And here's some of the principles of a constructivistic training model. We help participants personalize the information that we're giving them, and so that they can begin to integrate it further into their own lives. And we vary the structure of the class so it's not the same every time. And we create experiential learning opportunities in the seminar to help the participants to integrate the concepts into their own lives. We emphasize a multiple and a multicultural perspective to looking at trauma.
We also encourage self-reflection and meta-communication about participants' learning experiences. And we strive to make our classroom interactions and experiences serve as a living laboratory where people can experience the principles of personal and professional development. They can see them and experience them, from the modeling. The ultimate goal of a constructivistic teaching and learning model is to deepen and strengthen participants' sense of self. So this increased sense of self is one of the big outcomes that we see from our training, and particularly from using our constructivistic model.
There are also trauma-specific training components we'd like to talk to you about. For healing trauma and just not treating it, there's an emphasis on the role of the client-therapist relationship. A lot of the recent research is now pointing to this being a powerful tool for healing trauma and helping the client and the therapist get on the same page.
One of the things that the research is showing is that developmental trauma happens in the context of relationship, and therefore the client-therapist relationship is central to the healing. So if it's broken in relationship, it really has to be healed in relationship.
We also try to integrate theory, language, and practice that is based a lot on quantum sciences. The quantum sciences have a lot to teach us about how people interact with each other and some of the energy that happens in a client-therapist relationship.
Some of the terms that are now being drawn from the quantum sciences are the terms such as resonance, attunement, synchrony, and it has to do with the ability of the client and the therapist to get back into this kind of very early caregiver space, so that the person can experience some of the things in a healthy way, or to experience things that maybe they never experienced before because of neglect.
We also include the use of the TET, the trauma elimination technique, as part of a trauma-specific tool or training component. And then we also have added into the training an ongoing support group, because it basically, as you integrate this material, it takes a bit of time to get it all integrated. So we've included that as part of our model.
For additional information about our programs, you can visit our website. Here you can register, but you can also learn in more depth about our trauma-informed care trainings. We have a big piece of our website that's devoted to that. You can find us online at www, and then this is CO for Colorado, PROF for professional, DEV for center or development, and center. So it's the Colorado Professional Development Center.org. And when you first land there, you'll see this bar at the bottom of the page. That's what our navigation bar looks like. And you can see that kind of odd-shaped yellow triangle pointing up to certificate programs. That's where you begin your search. And when you go in through there, you'll see that it takes you into a couple of different routes.
We're offering 2 tracks of trauma-informed care training. And the first track is for practicing mental health professionals, counselors, social workers, psychologists, all the behavioral care professionals. And our spring training is a 26-hour certificate training that begins January 8th, 2016, and goes through March.
And you'll see then when you go into the certificate training, there's also a second track, which is for professionals, but this is for people who are not mental health practitioners. This would be educators, medical and dental professionals, other kinds of health caregivers, first responders. So this spring 19.5-hour certificate training program begins in February, and it goes through April. And in this training, we'll be partnering with Dr. Debbie Gravinik and her Trauma Training Institute.
I want to add one more thing, is we do offer CEUs for licensed professional counselors and also licensed professional counselors who are in the process of becoming licensed.
LPCCs.
Right.
Mm-hmm. We're NBCC. We're an NBCC provider.
Right. So for more information about our 2016 Trauma-Informed Care certificate trainings, And check our website at coloradoprofessionaldevelopmentcenter.org.
We also have made available at Amazon.com the textbook that we're using for our trauma-informed care trainings. You can purchase a copy of it there, and you can find us by its title called Developmental Trauma, the Game Changer in the Mental Health Profession.
People also have hidden developmental traumas that cause them to freak out. And to find out whether that applies to you, you can take our free online Freaked Out 101 self-quiz or sign up for our online course at www.freakedoutnomore.info.
That's www.freakedoutnomore.info. You'll also find a lot of useful information about developmental trauma on our flagship website, which is wineholds.org. That's wineholds.org. So that's our content for today. We hopefully have some questions, and we have time now for some comments and discussion. So, Bob, what do we have here?
Thanks, Barry and Janae. And so for those of you that are watching the webinar in your Adobe Connect window, please note at the lower right, there's a chat box. So we welcome your questions or comments at this point. So go ahead and enter those. And Barry and Janae will take those questions and answer those for you right now.
All right, so what are our questions, Bob?
So we have a question from Elena, and Elena asks, what are the symptoms that you look for in your clients to determine if they suffer from the effects of unhealed trauma?
What are the symptoms?
Yes, what are the symptoms that you look for in your clients to determine if they suffer from the effects of unhealed trauma?
Well, there's several things that we look at.
Yeah, one of them is we look at what conflicts they're having in their adult close relationships. That's often a signal that there's early developmental trauma that's now showing up in their adult relationships.
Okay.
And that's because we actually, in the first year of our life, form a relational template. And when we get close enough to another person, it doesn't matter whether it's somebody, we're in a love relationship with or not, but we just have to get close enough that this kind of attachment, developmental template shows up, and that's often when the conflicts emerge.
We have a lot of clients who come to us, and we're sort of the last resort before they go down and sign the divorce papers. And they come and they say, gee, when we were first married, we got along so well. Everything was wonderful. Now all we do is fight with each other. And one of the things we often say to them, well, congratulations, which is sort of surprising. And what it says is that basically we say to them, the conflicts that you have show me or show us that basically your relationship has deepened enough and it's safe enough now in the relationship for these to come to the surface. They were there from the beginning, but it wasn't safe enough for people to bring them up.
Can you talk a little bit about how you cover that topic and how you address those challenges in the seminars you have coming up next year?
Well, this is part of the experiential things that we do, because we go through a really step-by-step kind of early review of what happens during the bonding stage. And we look at optimally what should have happened, and then we look more at what typically does happen. And here we can see where there's breakdown, mostly from inconsistent caregiving. And most people are able to identify pretty quickly, where the model kind of applies to them. And we encourage people to do sort of family archaeology, to do talk to relatives, and to get more information about what was really going on with my parents, what was going on maybe even when I was being conceived, but what was the environment that I was born into.
We look at, and our developmental systems theory looks at basically how these systems of trauma can recapitulate themselves in relationships, in couples relationships, in family relationships, even in your business relationships. And so there's 4 stages that we talk about: the codependent stage, the counterdependent stage, the independent stage, and the interdependent stage. And so we have mapped out what we call the essential developmental processes that have to be completed in each system. So if you have a business, for example, that's not operating the way you want it, you go back and you look at, is there some kind of developmental process that didn't get finished that is now causing this business to be stuck? Or in a couple's relationship, the same thing. And frequently we see that the couples get stuck at the counter-dependent stage. And that's when the conflicts start to show up.
That's very interesting. I know from my own experience in some of the business endeavors I've undertaken that, getting to the root of some of those issues can be really important. We have another question from Valerie who asks, what are the spiritual impact you find in folks with developmental trauma?
It's very interesting that the child's first experience with the mother is really a very sacred kind of thing. And if there's something that disturbs what I would call this connection to the divine, that people often feel shut off later in life from spirit. It's not that they're not religious, it's just they have difficulty in finding something that makes them feel good. They have trouble connecting to the divine. I always think about people who are addicted to alcohol. It's like it's the search for spirit, that there's something really primal, but it has to do, I think, a lot with the loss of connection to the mother, if it's severe enough in that first year of life.
Okay.
A lot of the early traumas that we looked at are ones that would kind of go under the radar. People wouldn't remember them. They wouldn't understand how the long-term effects of those were now interfering with their life and their relationships. And so we have to help people, and we have developed tools to help people identify those very quickly. And so we get to the core of the problem. That's one of the things that we have specialized in, trying to get to the core of the problem, and we teach our trainees how to do that.
Mm-hmm. Ultimately, that goal is not just, as I said before, it's not just to deepen this sense of connection to self, but it's also to connect to spirit and to other, and to be able to have this give and take with another person who also is connected to the divine. I mean, that's been our most successful work with couples, is that they're able to get underneath the trauma and to find their connection to source again.
Very, very interesting. So here's a related question as well in this discussion about addiction and some of the effects of that. So Elena asks, is substance abuse related to developmental trauma, and if so, how?
Well, interestingly, it's intertwined with developmental trauma in a number of ways. When we look at addictions, we look at addictions as being a feeling disorder, meaning that people have some feeling that they don't want to experience, and so they turn to addictions of various kinds to self-medicate so they don't feel that feeling. And very frequently, that's a feeling that's connected with some early trauma. And so the addictions becomes a way of trying to avoid feeling the feelings and actually re-experiencing the trauma.
What we've seen is there's two basic kinds of addictions. One is an addiction to downers. Downers are things that help us relax. And so that can be alcohol, it can be marijuana, it can be thumb sucking, it can be certain kinds of sex, but the goal is to relax. And that's very connected to trauma during the bonding stage of development. The other set of addictions, the uppers, they're more ways of avoiding conflict or avoiding feelings, and they're very related to what happened during the separation stage of development. So these are things that keep us mobilized. So it's lots of exercise, lots of sex, lots of running, lots of shopping, lots of going, lots of traveling, go, do. Yeah. And the ultimate purpose of all of that is to help us keep us from falling back into that place where we have negative feelings or we feel pain.
So another question related to one that was asked earlier about some of the spiritual aspects of this. So Carmen asks, for those that do not want to use the word or concept of spiritual, could the terminology be changed to a deeper self-awareness?
I think it's all the same thing. And the real thing is this feeling of having the divine experience, whether it's in you or it's with another person. A lot of people experience this in meditation. I mean, they really can go to source by meditating, and I don't think we need to tie the experience to certain kinds of linguistic terms.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the development of the self, uh, uh, it's a subject that has been studied a long time by many people, and the deeper one gets into understanding oneself, the more likely one will develop kind of more of a spiritual or a larger view of themselves and other people. And they begin to see if there's something outside of their problems, for example, and they see the kind of the larger context for their life.
So the process and the context is essentially the same, and the language is in a way not as important.
Right.
You can frame it in a lot of different ways.
Right, and we really encourage that. I mean, this is part of the cross-cultural, multicultural, many perspectives. It doesn't really matter what words we put on it. The ultimate thing is about people's experience, and that they're able to name their own experience, not have it named for them.
Mm-hmm.
And they're able to hold on to that as part of this deepening sense of self.
And we see that one of the causes of trauma in the separation stage is the failure to complete what Carl Jung called individuation, or what some others have called the psychological birth, so that the self was never really totally born, and it becomes kind of an adapted self or a false self that one operates out of. And so to get people in touch with what, and many times when people come to therapy, that's what they're looking for. They're looking for a therapist to help them complete that. They don't say that, but that's really, if the therapist is tuned into that, they can help them to complete that process. And we have, in our books and in our training, we talk a lot about what therapists should do and shouldn't do to help their clients to complete this process.
Well, here's a related question. So, and I imagine that this is an area that you made some reference to this in your presentation, but Elena asked that she's heard that unhealed trauma can have long-term effects on people's physical health. And is that true? And if so, why?
Well, the thing is that developmental trauma is very stressful to the nervous system. It's really a form of, it's a stressor. And if people have long-term stress, it activates the adrenal stress response. And over a long period of time, it actually depletes the adrenals. People can go into adrenal stress, they can have adrenal fatigue, they can actually have adrenal exhaustion. And there are a number of people now who are studying all of this. And what we know from a biological perspective is that once the adrenals get depleted, they start to draw on all of the other organs. And so you can see a series of kind of cascading illnesses that are caused really by depleted adrenals. But people don't know that it's the real problem is the stress. And so it causes a lot of degenerative diseases as people get older.
We had an interesting opportunity. We lived in Slovakia when we worked for the United Nations on a project that's part of their International Year of the Family. And we saw a lot of young children in that culture. And they were much different than the children we saw here. First, they thought they may be retarded. Then we realized...
Well, we thought maybe they were developmentally delayed.
Yeah,
but they didn't look like American children.
But they were less adrenalized, for one thing. When you saw them out in public, you didn't see kids having temper tantrums or uproar, or they were kind of quiet and observant and behaved very well. We were surprised about that. Then we realized that the government of Slovakia provides 3 years of paid maternity leave.
They did then. I don't know if
I think they still do. So the mother could stay home and get her job held and be paid to stay home for 3 years. That provided an enormous foundation for these children. We don't have that in this country.
Well, I appreciate everyone sending in questions. We're getting a lot of good questions for the chat here. Here's another related question to early childhood. So Valerie asks, in my work as a counselor, since learning more about developmental trauma, I have wanted to explain better to my clients about the effect of pre-birth or young child experience. How can I explain this more clearly or easily to the client?
Well, it's useful to start kind of with the work of Thomas Averny, and he wrote a book called The Secret Life of the Unborn Child. And he's the first person, I think, that really explained the child experience of growing inside the mother.
Mm-hmm.
And his assumption, which I agree with, is that all children are sentient. They remember, they know, they understand from the very beginning. Many people have recall of things that happened while they were in utero. And so these very first experiences leave an imprint, and it leaves an imprint on the central nervous system. The birth itself leaves an imprint. That how people are introduced into the world has a lot to do with how people actually go out into the world. And that whole pre and perinatal period creates a template. And the first reactions with the parents in those first 2 or 3 months are extremely important in the child knowing what kind of environment I'm being born into and how my nervous system and my brain need to adapt so that I can survive in this climate. So for many people, and me in particular, because I had a traumatic birth and I've been able to witness the reenactment of my own birth pattern over and over and over. So I know personally about the power of it. I know some about Barry's, and I watch him reenact his sometimes.
Yeah, I had similar kind of early trauma related to my birth, and what really is necessary is that after birth, there has to be a reset of the nervous system
Mm-hmm.
to really help the child process out the trauma that happened during the birth.
Mm-hmm.
If there's not trauma before the birth, but even the birth itself is a very traumatic event, and without the support of parents who understand this, they say that the optimal bonding time for an infant with its parents is the first 12 to 24 to 48 hours at the most.
Mm-hmm.
And they recommend optimal skin-to-skin contact during that time to help the child reset its nervous system.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a very good question, Valerie, because there are a lot of therapists who don't know about pre and perinatal psychology. They haven't maybe worked on their own birth issues, and so they can't provide very good support. But there are people who have studied it. There's something called the Association for Pre and Perinatal Psychology, a group that's based out in California, and they've been studying this for over 30 years. They have an amazing website, and there's a tremendous amount of information that's available, and that people who want it can find it.
So you mentioned a book and an author at the start of this last question. Could you repeat that?
Thomas Verney,
Mm-hmm.
The Secret Life of the Unborn Child.
Thomas Verney, Secret Life of the Unborn Child.
Verney, I believe.
Okay.
It's Erny.
Okay.
Anyway.
Also, we have a question about. We have a few minutes left. We have a question about certificates and what kind of. I think that's a relevant question around what will participants get at the end of your seminar coming up. I want to hold that one for just a minute. We have a couple more questions about developmental trauma. So it's interesting watching the two of you interact and what you two of you know about each other's past and how you dealt with your trauma. So we have a question about what would you say that couples have interlocking traumas?
Well, that's been our experience personally, and it's also been our experience in working with a lot of couples that there is almost like an unseen hand that helps people find the right person to evoke, provoke, trigger all of these patterns so that they can be healed. And we always say that the more that you provoke your partner, the better the partner you've chosen, because I think these things at a soul level really are seeking to be healed.
Well, quantum physics talks about unified field theory,
Mm-hmm.
and that every one of us has sort of a field that we emit certain kinds of energies, and other people do the same. And somehow our fields come together unconsciously
Mm-hmm.
to heal something that didn't get healed early on.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not a conscious process, but we
try to help people
we're
make it a conscious
amazed at how perfect it is.
Mm-hmm.
People who are come together and don't know exactly at that level why they came together.
Well, and I know that you have decades of experience in that realm amongst the two of you, and I know that's something that you'll bring to these seminars, and that's a very important component of what that's about.
Right, as part of what we bring in what we call the container. It's the field of energy that actually everyone shares as we're doing our learning and healing together.
Okay, so as we finish this, as we wrap this up, Um, Tell us a little bit more about what kind of certificate or credentials, and I know you mentioned in your presentation that there's an opportunity for continuing education credits. Talk a little bit about that, about what participants will walk away with after they've taken these seminars.
Well, our trainings are directed mostly at mental health professionals. And so we offer certificates for people who are not licensed professional counselors or not LPCCs. These are the candidates. So people can use these for continuing education credits. They can take their certificate away. For people who are actually licensed as a professional counselor or in the process of becoming licensed, we offer NBCC approved CEUs, and NBCC is a national accrediting licensing agency for the country. So most people are also NCC licensed, and so these are things that you can use for that. And people can also include them in their personalized programs that they have for their renewal of their licenses.
Okay.
And we're finding more and more that agencies, big mental health centers like Aspen Point, are looking for applicants who have trauma-informed care in their background, have certificates that show that they've been trauma-informed. And so I think as people begin to move into maybe if they've been just finishing their program and want to get a job, this is a credential that is now being valued and seen as very important.
Okay, so we've got a couple minutes left. So as we wrap up, I want to remind people that in your Adobe Connect window in the upper right, you'll see two links: one to the Colorado Professional Development Center website, and one to the seminar sign-up page. So we encourage you to go there and to participate in the seminar coming up, and take note of the phone number there as well, should you want to contact Barry or Janae with future questions. We'll wrap this up here in just a minute. We have one more question, and Elena asks, how do you know if your client has attachment issues?
This is pretty obvious in the way that people talk about their intimacy issues, whether or not they're able to create, to sustain intimacy. And if people are having problems with intimacy, it usually means that they have some kind of disturbance in their attachment.
Okay, all right. Barry and Janae, thank you very much. It's been a very informational, very informative webinar today. And again, we encourage everyone to go out and check out the details on the seminars coming up in 2016. We look forward to seeing you there. We'll leave the Adobe Connect window open for a few minutes should you want to use those links. And again, as we mentioned earlier, we'll be sending out via email a link to the recorded seminar and other resources as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob.